Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Regional Qualifiers overview and analysis video. I want to thank you guys for being patient with some of these videos. As you know, I was out of town for Labor Day weekend here in the United States, and so I wasn't able to post the last 3 days, but I've got a lot of catching up to do, and that starts here with the LPL. We're going to go through every single game of the regional finals, the regional qualifiers today in this video. We're going to be going through, obviously, every single team that qualifies to Worlds from the LPL, so everything that has to do with the LPL for the rest of the year is going to be wrapped up in today's video, the last domestic video we will be making for the LPL in 2024. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. If you want to know my thoughts on the LPL leading into this, check out the videos and the playlist up in the iCard. That's going to be every single video that we've done on the LPL over the course of the summer split, including every single playoff series and every single playoff game individually covered. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, please check that out up in the iCard. But today we've got a lot to go over because there are 3 best of 5s, yes, 3 full best of 5s to get to in today's video. So strap in, it's going to be a long one, probably the longest LPL video, at least outside of the primers, of the entire year. So let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in all 3 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said, by the end of this video, we are going to know all 4 of our representatives from the LPL at Worlds this year, and so we'll kind of talk about that, whether or not I think it's the right 4 teams and whether or not I think any of them have a real shot to win the tournament. Spoiler alert, absolutely, it's the LPL, but most of today will be spent talking about the matchups that it took to get there. So without further ado, let's get into the analysis. Up on the screen, of course, the bracket here for the LPL regional qualifiers. 4 teams end up qualifying. Of course, Bilibili Gaming, Top Esports having already qualified for the World Championships. Bilibili by being the champions of the LPL in the summer split. Top Esports by having the most championship points out of the remaining teams. They are going to be your number 1 and your number 2 seeds, but seeds 3 and 4 are up for grabs in this little mini tournament. We're going to talk about all of the series, but of course, you can see the first series that we're going to cover, that's going to determine our number 3 seed. It's the 3 and the 4 seed, at least coming out in terms of championship points facing off, and then the loser of that will face the winner of the series below that, which we will also cover, and the winner of that 3rd and final series will get the number 4 seed. So 4 teams fighting for 2 spots to go to Worlds, and we're going to determine our first one here in our first series, which you can see on the screen. It's the number 3 versus number 4 matchup. For that number 3 seed at Worlds, it's the number 3 seeded Weibo Gaming taking on the number 4 seeded LNG Esports. Obviously, this is an intriguing matchup, one we already saw in the playoffs in the kind of 3rd, 4th place matchup in lower bracket in the summer split playoffs, and Weibo was able to get the better of LNG in that particular instance, but this is a much more interesting matchup on paper than it showed in that series itself. Weibo was on a ridiculously hot run, and honestly, they still kind of are. They're coming off of a finals appearance where they did lose to Bilibili Gaming. It wasn't a particularly close series, but they still made the finals of the LPL summer split. That's a huge accomplishment. Making finals is very much not the easiest thing in the world in a region like the LPL, and so this team is still coming into this series, I think, with a lot of hype and a lot of expectation. But LNG on the other side of this, I mean, they came in as the number 2 seed in the playoffs. This is a team that I think people were considering, overrated or frauds or whatever. A lot of the conversation surrounding them coming out of the regular season was that their record was deceiving, and obviously that kind of proved to be true, but I think there is a very strong case to be made that they just didn't play up to their own standards in the playoffs, that a lot of things ended up going wrong, but a lot of the things that I said in the preview for that series in the playoffs when these 2 teams played against each other, it's absolutely still the case in this one. This really is an interesting matchup between former teammates who are kind of the focal points of their teams, and those are the 2 players that I think you have to watch out for. Tarzan is the guy for Weibo Gaming. I don't know if there is a single player in the world for a team near the top of the standings that is as important for their individual team's success as Tarzan is for Weibo. When he wins, this team often is in really good positions. When he loses, this team is doomed. Like, even sometimes when he wins, this team is in a bad spot because Xiaohu or Crisp or Breathe are running it down and just creating these unwinnable situations for him. But Tarzan has really been the guy for Weibo Gaming. It's why he was an MVP, consideration for me throughout a lot of this split. I think he has been, like, genuinely one of the most valuable junglers in the entire world. But you could say something very similar about Scout on the other side of this. They end up giving him first team All-Pro, I think, on the broadcast, like the actual individual awards. I certainly didn't think nearly as high of the beginning part of his year. I definitely wanted to give him credit for being really good down the stretch, but when Scout is doing well and when he's winning, this team is almost impossible to end up beating because they're so good at playing around him in late game team fights. But when he's not doing that, when he's able to, lose in the early game, when teams take advantage of his weakness in the early parts of the game, then it's really hard for them to actually come out and win games. And so I think the two teammates going head-to-head, it's the most important player on both teams. If Tarzan's able to have these awesome early games with his super aggressive pathing that creates a ton of advantages for Weibo players that wouldn't normally have it, Weibo's going to be in a great spot, just like they were in that previous series, which is exactly what happened. But for LNG, they like to slow the pace down. They are by far the slowest team near the top of the standings here in the LPL. They do not want to play fast. They do not want to play aggressive. They want to play for these late game team fights. If they can stretch out the length of a lot of these games and really get, to these late game 5v5s at a relatively neutral pace, I think that's where LNG really thrives. Now, they weren't exactly perfect in that phase in the playoffs, but, if you have to play to your team's strengths, and even if it wasn't working before, you have to hope that it's going to be able to turn around because this team is never suddenly just going to become a really good early game team. So, I think the clashing styles here makes it really, really interesting, but one of these teams will be qualifying for Worlds from this series, and we're going to find out who it is by going game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was LNG. They are going to take game number 1 of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And they looked awesome here in game number 1. It's basically everything you could have asked from them in terms of playing out the mid game very aggressively, actively getting leads for their carries, and then playing around them well in the late game. I thought that there were some awesome playmaking, games and just potential here from LNG. I really do think they just played the map incredibly well. Weibo Gaming didn't really have an answer. They were okay in the early sections of this game, but slowly they just started getting picked off over and over again. Sometimes that really aggressive pathing that we talk about, not only from Tarzan, but just the aggressive play from like Xiaohu or Crisp, that, they're very willing to move around the map and try to skirmish early. Sometimes that's super punishable, and that's kind of what happened here. LNG just found opportunities and angles to try to take Weibo down during their rotations, and eventually LNG had enough of a gold lead where they just had to make a couple of plays towards the end of this game, and all of a sudden things were moving in their favor. Player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Scout for me in the mid lane. I know Broadcast gave this to Gala. I'll talk about why I think that's generally fine a little bit later, even though obviously scoreline-wise it's very different. Scout was the guy. I think you're overthinking it by giving anyone else player of the game. Getting the Smolder ahead is what gave LNG all of the tempo and the pressure needed to make a lot of the plays that they ended up making. So Gala hitting arrow after arrow in a lot of these clutch situations was huge, and obviously he's super good at Ashe in terms of kiting and playing out a lot of these 5v5s. It's why this team has been so consistent in terms of their 5v5 team fighting, not just because Scout is really good in that zone, because he is, but also because Gala is really good in that area of the game. And so, you do want to give credit to Gala where it's due, but again, getting Smolder super ahead early on in this game is what kind of doomed Weibo. There really was no way for them to fight a lot of these choke point fights around objectives that LNG was essentially forcing at every available opportunity, because you can't walk into Smolder. If you walk into Smolder, especially with like 3 or 4 kills at 10 minutes, you're just going to get blown up and you're just going to die. And, eventually they were able to get him some tower plates, and he hit his breakpoint at like 15 minutes. Like, it was truly absurd how quick Scout got online in this one, and it made it basically impossible for Weibo to end up fighting out the rest of this game. So to me, Scout definitely the most important player, even if you can't like look at Scout and say it was all him, it was all his mechanical outplays. Like, he got fed on the Smolder because of some good interference from Weiwei, from Hong, from Gala. But at the end of the day, like, he was still the most important player and the most important champion in this game. So Gala looking great on the Ashe, it's great, but Scout was definitely the carry. I want to give a big shout out to Hong. I thought he was awesome in this game on the Rel. A couple of fantastic engages. Sometimes it can be difficult to play Rel in a matchup where there are just a lot of high mobility champions on the other side, like Corki, Ezreal, things like that. Even the Poppy, like, makes it very difficult for Rel to operate in like a really aggressive way throughout a lot of this game. I think Hong managed to balance that really well, and I think set up for the brand and for the Smolder very well. Weiwei had some very good mid-game pathing. I think the damage was obviously very good from him. Some early game mistakes, but generally speaking, you just have to live with that from Weiwei. It's kind of what you get. Zika was fine, but he got a solo kill on Xiaohu in the top lane. That's pretty nice to be able to stop that teleport and make that play happen, but Scout really was the star. This was a Smolder game. You got the Smolder fed, and you ended up winning it. Very simple, very easy to execute here for LNG. And then for Weibo, again, I just think it happens. Like, these are the kinds of games that you just have to live with when you're an early game team. because you can't really just like shut off the Smolder. The moment you start giving him gold, you know, when he's at 3 or 4 kills at 11 minutes or whatever he was at, like there's just not a ton that you can do if LNG actually plays it out well. I am going to give dud of the game to Tarzan in the jungle. I love Tarzan. That's certainly not up for debate, but there was a lot that I think could have been changed about the beginning part of this game to not get Smolder as fed. I think putting a lot of time and resources into the mid lane, trying to get Xiaohu into a good position ended up being a pretty big mistake because it just opened the opportunity for a lot of these trades to end up happening, which does benefit LNG in the long run. I think if Tarzan actually put a lot of his pressure into the bot lane or even the top lane to try to get someone else ahead, or alternatively, if you just are calling Crisp and you're like, hey, I want to go invade, I want to try to shut down the brand, I think that's probably a little bit more consistent of a strategy here, but because he was willing to put his neck out to try to get his Corki ahead, all of a sudden the Smolder was kind of trading kills with that, and the game gets to a spot where it's not super playable. I think that, generally speaking, Tarzan could play this game again and it could go rather well. Like, you know, if some of these early fights end up changing, if you are able to get these ganks off without trading a lot of kills over to the Smolder, then this game could have just been over instantly, but that's not how it ended up happening, and that's the problem when you take a risk like that. But Xiaohu was also pretty bad, especially in the back half of the game. They really tried a lot to get him ahead early on the Corki, and it just didn't really end up working out. He was pretty much entirely useless throughout a lot of this game. His macro rotations weren't exactly ideal, gets picked off trying to teleport in the top lane. Just not a great game from him. I think Light, Crisp, Breathe, they were just along for the ride. Crisp, I thought, was pretty good on the Poppy this game, but just not really a lot to do in this one. And so for Weibo, you're now just down 0-1. You have to be able to bounce back in game number 2. You have to be able to tie up the series. Winning 3 in a row isn't impossible against a team like LNG. We know that they can crumble under the pressure, but you don't want to have to be put in that position. You want to be able to battle back and try to win your own like pseudo best of 3 coming out 1-1. But LNG, I'm sure, wants to get that 2-0 series lead. They want to be able to take full control and prove to everyone that they do deserve to be in this conversation, because I think a lot of people are kind of counting them out as even a Worlds team, let alone a team going as the number 3 seed. So who's going to pick up that game 2? Is LNG going to take control of this series fully, or is Weibo Gaming going to fight back and tie us up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was LNG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is starting to look like a bit of a stomp, if we're being honest. LNG has just looked infinitely better than Weibo through the first 2 games here. I can't say I'm entirely surprised. This is not like a huge shock for me or anything. I figured Weibo would be favorited in this series by a lot of people, and I see this much more as a 50-50. I think Weibo is just one of those teams that you can never really sit there and bet on. Like, I can't put any faith or confidence that this team is ever going to be who we think they're going to be, whether good or bad at any given time. This team can win Worlds and this team can miss Worlds. Like, both of those realities are absolutely true for them, and so for them to be down 0-2 at the start of this series, again, it's not entirely surprising. They just got outplayed in this game. When they lose pressure in the early game, they don't have like a secondary playstyle. They don't have like a fallback plan, and especially when you're going for this comp that is really execution reliant in terms of like getting the Smolder online and having pressure with things like the Sedge, playing around the Renekton and the Misfortune in the early game, it's not going to work if you lose, and that's the problem, right? LNG's comp is way, way easier, and it just ends up working out for them in that case. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Zika is going to get my player of the game here. I mean, this is a no-brainer. The Gnar was unbelievable. A couple of solo kills on the top side here for him. They trade 1-for-1 at the start of the game, and then, of course, he just picks off Breathe for being way too far forward. We will talk about Breathe in just a second, but he was awesome in a lot of these fights as well. Great flank angles on a couple of them, specifically the Soul fight for the Mountain Soul, where he ends up getting this awesome flank angle and ends up like completely taking over the game, basically, from that point onwards. He was just awesome in this game. I know I've used that word a ton, but truly going and watching the game, there's really not a lot of like intricacies. There's not any like weird, crazy Gnar plays that he ends up pulling off. He just understands the champion really well and understands where he can get his priority and utilize that, I guess, at a really high level. So credit to Zika, really good game from him. I want to give a shout out to Hong and Gala as well, who continue to look great here. Light and Crisp have been pretty solid for Weibo, especially in their playoff run. Crisp was really good, and Light is their main carry, especially in the later half of the game when Xiaohu is just not playing well. They rely a lot on Light to be able to deal a lot of the damage, even if Tarzan is the one kind of setting everyone up. And so for Gala to just come out and do way more damage than Light in a lot of these games on something like Jhin, it's a big plus. Jhin has continued to be incredibly successful here in the LPL. I'm honestly shocked it doesn't have a higher priority rate because of just how good it has been as a champion here specifically specifically in the LPL. It's one of the big reasons why I'm so high on the champion in general, but Gala continues to be in the right place at the right time. Maybe a bit over-eager on some of the ultimates. Maybe you could have held some of those and tried to set up for more aggressive plays moving forward, but still generally fine. And Hong has honestly been great through the first 2 games. It's really hard to make an impact on Rel in game 1, like we said, and the Rakan here, obviously a lot more options than maybe you had in game 1, and he was just as good, if not better, here in game number 2. So bot lane looking good, Scout looking good on the Corki, doing a lot of damage, not really putting himself in bad positions, and, you know, making sure Xiaohu isn't getting fed. This was kind of the way to play out this matchup. They have now LNG, that is, won both sides of this Corki Smolder matchup because they just understand it better. And then Weiwei was solid on the Maokai. Again, I think one of the big reasons why LNG has actually gotten better is because Weiwei has been willing to pick things like Maokai a lot more than he was at the beginning of the year. I think their scaling is their strength, and, you know, you really simplify the comp down to Maokai plus Corki and then, you know, Gnar and Jhin to kind of add that support, and it ends up working out for you. So LNG looking really solid, really, really good, I would say, through the first 2 games, just kind of doing what they do best, and Weibo Gaming just not showing up on the day. Now, they're not eliminated by any means, not even if they lose this game, but they're not out of this series. Like, there really is a world in which they end up winning 3 in a row, because that's just what Weibo does, but there are so many things that this team has to clean up. Breathe has to be better. He's going to get dead of the game. He's gotten a lot of these over the course of this year. I think people are generally, like, hanging on to the name a bit more than what you typically would see with the top laner. I was actually a big Breathe defender for a long time because it felt like people were trashing him just because the rest of his team was bad, and especially on RNG at the beginning of the year, like, he was really good for them in the 1v1s. He was actively trying his best to win games, and it just wasn't working out. It reminded me a lot of Ale on EDG, and obviously that ended up working out for Anyone's Legend when he went over there. Breathe has not been quite as good on Weibo, especially in the 1v1s. He's dying solo a lot, and honestly, he's really not been that great of a team fighter. That's his big advantage as a player. That's his strength, and that's not really worked out for them. So hopefully Breathe can get back on track. I don't think Tarzan has been particularly good this series either. Wasn't good in game 1, wasn't really that good here in game 2. And we talked about it. Without Tarzan, like, actively doing stuff in the early game for Weibo, they're genuinely doomed. Like, they get down, like, 5k gold regularly when Tarzan is not completely popping off. That's how good he has been. And I know it feels like I'm glazing him so much, but, like, he is that important to Weibo's success. When he is playing well, this team can beat anybody. But when he's shut down, like, when he's not playing well or when he's not able to do anything, like, this team doesn't have alternative win conditions. They are very one-dimensional in that regard. The Smolder wasn't able to get online because, you know, LNG was very happy to not take trades in the middle of the map in the early part of this game. Light was doing damage, but oftentimes the bullet times were, again, very aggressive, very similar to what I said about the Jhin ult for Gala on the other side. Just way too early in a lot of these fights and at bad angles where you're just not getting priority targets. Very weird. You know, I don't know why they felt the need to rush. Maybe it's just nerves and jitters from the stage, but, you know, generally speaking, Weibo has to be cleaner in terms of their execution, and if they continue to lose in the early game to a team that's better than them in the late game, it's doomed. Like, you can't win that. And so Weibo has to get back into their zone, but I could just as easily see this being a 3-0 sweep as I could seeing this be a reverse sweep. So, you know, we'll see what ends up happening. If they are going to keep the series alive, it has to start here in game 3, but I'm sure LNG wants to close this out and get themselves to Worlds and kind of prove a lot of those doubters wrong, like I've said throughout this series. So who's going to be able to take game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to clean sweep this series 3-0, and Weibo Gaming in the last 2 days is now 0-6. It is a brutal schedule here for the team that ends up losing in the finals if they don't end up qualifying. I genuinely hate the way that the LPL does this. The fact that this series is taking place the day after LPL finals, I should say, is absurd. Like, I genuinely think that it's one of the stupidest scheduling decisions they could possibly make, but as you guys know, as I've said on the channel, I think the LPL schedule is generally very dumb. I think it has been for many, many years. The lack of announcements, the lack of, I guess, forethought and clarity put into when these teams are playing games, I think is very apparent, especially to Western fans. But I digress. Let's talk about the game instead of just complaining for Weibo's sake. I certainly think it had something to do with their performance here today, but you know, I don't want to take anything away from LNG. I think they deserved this win. They came out and executed their own game plan really well, and honestly, they were better basically across the board. There really wasn't anybody on Weibo that I was like, yeah, you played excellent, you deserved to win. I think Tarzan easily had his best game of the series, but it just didn't really matter. Nobody else on the team was really doing anything. They put a lot of time and effort into trying to get this Corki into a good position because Xiaohu really needs that. Like, this team needs him to actually be good, and it just wasn't happening. He was, you know, okay for a lot of this game, and then he makes one critical error that ends up losing Weibo the entire game in the first place. So, it is what it is, but we'll talk about that in a second. Not only is this player going to get my player of the game, but my player of the series as well. It's going to go to Zika in the top lane. He was awesome. He was incredible throughout all 3 of these games. Really felt like he was the most influential player of LNG. I think specifically because he was so much more impactful than Breathe on the other side of this matchup, and in a matchup that I think a lot of people are looking at as a quote-unquote Kennen-favored matchup. I don't necessarily see it that way. I think K'Sante is just as useful in a lot of these 5v5 team fights, but he was really good at team fighting, and that's really what you're asking him to do. Not only that, but he picks up, technically not a solo kill in this game, but really another solo kill. K'Sante into Kennen is not one of those matchups where K'Sante should be getting a solo kill, and so you just want to give Zika a lot of credit. He is a top laner that I think has had some phenomenal performances over the course of this split. I think that there were some games that were bad from him, and obviously the inconsistency kind of bleeding over from the spring split still leaves a lingering taste in a lot of people's mouths, but the good games were definitely back, especially during their run in the back half of the summer split, like Group Ascend. I thought he was really good in that section. Pretty good for them in the playoffs, and then really good for them in this series to get them to qualify for Worlds. But Scout, obviously another player that you want to shout out. A couple of mistakes in terms of the positioning. Sometimes Zeri can be too far forward. Weibo definitely put a lot of time and effort into trying to make sure the Corki was in a better position than the Zeri. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. I guess you can see that from the result, but Scout was really good throughout a majority of this series, and they kind of need that. Gala was awesome. I think the Jhin continues to be a really, really solid pick. It does way more damage than people give it credit for, and Gala, I think, executed it well. Hong was amazing in this game on the Rakan. Multiple really stellar engages. He was the other player besides Zika that I was really considering for player of the game. I ended up giving it to the K'Sante. I just felt like he was slightly more impactful in some of those fights, but Hong was excellent, and then Weiwei was really good as well. The Ivern was very important through this game. It's really nice to see Weiwei genuinely taking a backseat role. He is not the star of this team. He's probably the 5th person I think about when it comes to LNG, at least at the current moment, but that's an okay role for him to take so long as he is willing to take it. That's sometimes been a problem for him in the past. Not being a primary carry has sometimes been an issue, but it seems to be working out for LNG at the current moment. But just generally for LNG, you have to feel excited. You have to feel interested in what this team can do. They've now qualified for Worlds. More on that in just a second. But for Weibo Gaming on the other side here, you're not out of this tournament by any means. Worlds is not out of your reach. You just move in to that 4th seed match, and they'll find out who they're playing in just a second as we go into our second series. But they really need to get their head back on straight. I think losing to BLG definitely took away a lot of the momentum that they generated in the playoffs, being able to take down some teams that maybe they weren't anticipating beating, like LNG, like Top Esports. I think a lot of that momentum was washed away in their finals loss, and that clearly carried over into this, but 2 best of 5s in back-to-back days, not winning a single game in either. It's definitely got to take a mental toll on a team that relies a lot on their mental confidence to actually play well. Tarzan is so important, and he was okay in this game. Xiaohu was super fed and actually had a ton of gold on the Corki because that was the entire game plan for Weibo, but one major mistake by Xiaohu, getting caught out in the river right before Dragon. They should have gotten Soul off of that, or they should have been building towards Soul off of that, and all of a sudden the game is completely destroyed by Corki just getting caught out for no reason. They can't really fight in a lot of these situations. The Corki ends up getting outscaled by the Zeri damage. K'Sante really makes it a lot more difficult for him to play the game, and things just completely fall apart. This was winnable for them. More winnable, I would say, than either Game 1 or Game 2, but yet they couldn't get it done in the end, and that's kind of the story of Weibo. They need these gigantic leads in order to feel comfortable with them going into the late game because they're just not all that clinical in terms of their execution, and we saw that once again here. But dud of the game is super easy. It's going to go to Crisp in the support position. Genuinely one of the worst support games I've seen in a while. Just fails to block Jhin ults on his AD carry and lets Light die for no reason. Full engages on Daisy. Just very, very weird stuff. Crisp, you just have to sometimes wonder what he's thinking, because some games he rolls up and is genuinely one of the best supports in the world, and other games he rolls up and is genuinely one of the worst supports in the world. So I don't really know what to make of that. This was just a horrible game number 3 from him, but you have to hope he's going to be able to turn it around. Breathe also just continues to be rather inconsequential. Couple of nice ultimates at the end of the game end up not leaning him in the favor of dud of the game, but he was really bad in the laning phase, and again, that's what it's what you draft him for, and so for him to be so bad in that phase, it's just really not ideal. Tarzan was good, Xiaohu was good outside of the major mistake, and Light was generally fine throughout this series, but Weibo just didn't have the firepower necessary to take down LNG in their phase of the game, and that means they're going to have one more series to get themselves to Worlds as a finalist in the LPL. It would be pretty absurd for the team to make finals in the summer split to not make Worlds, but we'll see what ends up happening with them. But congratulations to LNG. As we said, they now get the number 3 seed going to Worlds, and I think some people were counting this team out. Again, there was a lot of sentiment surrounding them that not only are they not going as the number 3 seed, they're not going to Worlds at all. At least that was kind of the expectation from some people. That was not really something I was ever on board with. I like this team a lot more than the average analyst seems to, or certainly the Reddit analyst seems to. And I think they played up to their own expectations today. This is not some dominating team that's going to obliterate you in 20 minutes and look super unbelievable while doing so. They're going to be a little bit more methodical in terms of their plotting, but that can really work against teams that just don't really have answers to these neutral game states. They stayed cool, calm, and collected. They got great performances out of some of their, players that needed to step up, like Zika, like, Hong, like Gala, and Scout continues to be someone that they can really play through so long as he is in good positions. And so I feel good about LNG, maybe not the scariest team in the entire world from a playstyle perspective. They're not going to blow your socks off in terms of just the raw dominance they show, but they are going to be a team that you have to care about and you have to prep for basically in every matchup. But then moving on now to our second series of the video, and this isn't quite a Worlds qualifying series, but it keeps you alive and puts you in the race one more series away to get that 4th and final seed. It's a matchup between the number 5 seeded Ninjas in Pyjamas and the number 6 seeded JD Gaming, and I really didn't think either of these teams would be here for polar opposite reasons. JDG really has no business being in the regional qualifiers with as good of a roster as they have, but they have disappointed basically the entirety of the summer split. Even in the regular season, there were moments where it was just we were kind of waiting for this team to get their shit together, and it just wasn't necessarily happening for them. It really did feel like a 2v8 for a majority of this season, and we'll talk about why that's pretty significant going into Ninjas in Pyjamas, because honestly, both of these teams are 2v8 in a lot of these games. You're really relying on your 2 best players for both of these teams in a lot of circumstances, and it's really just going to be about which 2 players are better on their individual team. For JDG, that's obviously their 2 stars. It's Kanavi in the jungle, who I think at this point is honestly pretty underrated just because JDG is not doing particularly well. People are forgetting just how influential and important Kanavi has been towards JDG's success over the course of this year and this split. He's still one of the best junglers in the world. He's still performing like one of the best junglers in the world. The problem for JDG has not been Kanavi. It's not been him getting absolutely obliterated. Now, the concern in the series against Ninjas in Pyjamas that knocked them out of playoffs was that Kanavi wasn't getting nearly as many leads as he needed to against a player like Leon, and that he wasn't punishing him nearly enough in order for JDG to get that momentum. But if Kanavi has a good series, if he's the best player in this series, which I think is pretty reasonable to expect, then JDG's in an okay spot. And you could say something very similar about Ruler in the bot lane. They have been the 2 players to really step up. Ruler, I think, has been a little bit quieter in terms of how good he has been. I think he's been significantly better than he was in spring. I was raising a lot of questions about him on this channel when we were covering the LPL in the spring split. I've not had nearly as many in summer. I think a lot of his individual plays have actually been pretty good, but the reason that JDG is continuing to struggle is they cannot find answers in all of the other positions. Missing has, in my opinion, been very underwhelming over the course of this year, and this split in particular. I think Ruler being really good has kind of masked how Missing has just not played really all that well, especially in the mid game over the course of 2024. Yagao has obviously been very documentably bad for this team. He's kind of the scapegoat at the current moment, but one that I do think is relatively justified. It just doesn't feel like it's his meta at the current moment. A lot of these 80 carries in the mid lane, it just doesn't feel like he's particularly comfortable on them. If this was a meta where he could play Talia and, Zoe and things like that, then yeah, maybe I'd feel a bit better, but it's just not where we're at right now, and Yagao is really struggling to kind of take that role and run with it. He's been one of the more disappointing mid laners in the LPL, and they've still not really been able to settle on who they want to play in the top lane. Flandre played their playoff series, but he barely played at all in the summer split because Sheer was starting. I still think it would be absurd, and I guess I'll spoil it now. I think it is absurd that Flandre is playing. I think it is a majorly bad decision for JDG that actively makes their team worse, but who knows? Flandre sometimes has stepped up for this team in the playoffs. You talk about the spring split when they won their only series, their only best of 5. Flandre was really good in that win. Obviously, they weren't particularly good after that, and so you can't necessarily look at that as a huge positive, but I just don't really see the same kind of consistency that you were getting out of Sheer. I get that he's a young player and maybe isn't as experienced, but I think you're holding your own team back by making that decision. But for NIP, it's not like the story is all that different on the other side here. They were able to take down JDG in the playoffs, but their problems are still very real. They're very much, in my opinion, a 2v8 team, kind of a 2.5 win team, if you will, depending on the results you get from some of the other players. But the one you can't deny is Rookie in the mid lane. He is the guy for NIP in the same way that I think Kanavi has kind of been the guy for JD Gaming for a lot of this year. He reminds me so much of, what we talk about in a lot of these other regions with like bad teams of these mega carries. The difference is that he is so good that NIP has a chance to go to Worlds just purely based off of Rookie. He is either going to win or lose you the game. Honestly, the player that I've compared him to the most over the course of this year has been Showmaker over in the LCK. I think their performances have been very similar, and I think that is a good sign for Rookie because Showmaker is still one of those players that you could rely on to basically win any game. Rookie can beat anyone. He can dominate any series, but there also are going to be moments where he gets behind because he's trying to win super hard in the early game, and then NIP falls apart because they can't play through anybody but him. I do think Zhuo is the other player that I want to shout out for being a really big positive for NIP. He was awesome in their playoff run, kind of their miraculous playoff run to get here, if you will. I think he's always been a big game performer. He was really good in the playoffs for NIP in the spring split as well. He was a big reason why that team ended up making top 4 in the first place. So I actually really believe in Zhuo. I think he's the better support, at least in terms of form right now in this series, and that's crazy to say. I wouldn't have in a million years have said that at the beginning of the year, but Missing is very much not in form. Zhuo very much does feel like he's in form, but the rest of this team, that's the question mark in the same way that it is for JDG. I am not a Photic believer. I am, in fact, a Photic hater. It's been very well documented on this channel that I've just never really seen him as somebody that can be an elite AD carry at this level, and he is somebody who has had a history of underperforming in big moments, specifically for teams like Victory 5 in the past. Then you've got Leon and Shanji, two very flippy players. Leon obviously has kind of the reputation of being a bit of a Zyra one-trick in the current meta. We know that's not the case. The Nidalee still has to get banned basically every game, or at least teams are very scared of the Nidalee. He's shown he can play things like Brand, a lot of these AP carries, but he is very one-dimensional in terms of his style. He wants to be able to play these AP carries that, snowball the game out of control and try to play for aggressive early game pathing. When that doesn't work, when the enemy jungler takes that away, he's in a really bad spot, as we saw in their series loss to Weibo right before getting out of the playoffs. And then Shanji has just been like the flippiest player in the LPL. I mean, truly, it's just been, you have no idea what you're going to get out of him on a game-to-game basis. So a lot to kind of mull over in terms of previewing this series, because there is a lot to talk about. But I think JDG have to be considered favorites. If they lose this, it's a massive upset, regardless of the fact that NIP beat them the last time around. They are expecting to go to Worlds, and this is the first step they need to get there. But are they going to be able to live up to that, or is NIP actually going to shut down that door once again and send them home this time for the year? Well, we're going to find out going game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and we're already starting to get some repeats, some flashbacks, if you will, of the previous time that these two teams played off against each other. Rookie gets monstrously fed in this game on the Zeri, is able to completely take over every single one of these aggressive exchanges, and a game that at one time looked almost entirely neutral, where NIP was actually in some hot water, completely disintegrates, and JDG just don't have the answers to be able to save the game, regardless of how well some of the players in the game ended up playing. We will talk about that, of course, when we touch upon JDG, but player of the game for me, it's Rookie. Not for me, the player of the game was Rookie. There is no conversation about this. He was unbelievable in this game on the Zeri, and this just goes back to what we were talking about. When this team wins, it is almost always off the back of Rookie just getting incredibly fed in the mid lane. That's just kind of their win condition. It's what they like to play through. That's why Leon's addition, I think, has been such a positive for the team, because he's put so much time and attention in the early game into getting mid lane ahead, and if you can do that for NIP, Rookie is good enough to win any game, and he obliterated JDG in these team fights. There was actually no answer for him, regardless of what they tried to throw at him. And again, I want to mention this, JDG didn't even really play all that bad in this game. NIP was just better, and Rookie was just better. When you put him on something like Zeri that has so much agency in the late game to be able to make a lot of those moves on her own, it's really, really fun to watch. I like Zeri as a champion. I know that's a bit of a controversial opinion, because I do think she's very skill expressive at the top level. There is a clear difference between the players who are good at Zeri and good at the game, and the players who are just okay at Zeri. It is very noticeable when you put Zeri on one of the best players in the world, and that's what you got here when Rookie picked her up. So Really great game from him to kick off the series. Zhuo also continues to just be such a major positive for this team. Constant 2, 3, 4-man engages coming out from the rel. This really has been a dynamic duo throughout a lot of the playoffs, and Zhuo continues to step up in big moments. It's honestly been a career trend for him. He is really good in high-pressure situations, and that's a really good trait to have, even if his bot lane partner isn't necessarily always like that. I feel like he missed every single arrow in this game. You know, we'll talk about it. He was certainly not the better AD carry in this game, even on his team. He might have been the worst of the 4 in this game, but it doesn't really matter. It was fine. He didn't make any sort of egregious errors that make me like super upset or anything. He just wasn't necessarily contributing to the positives that this team was doing. Leon was good on the brand. I continue to think Nasus is a complete bait pick. I really have not seen anything from this champion that leads me to believe that he is more useful than a lot of the other champions you're going to pick in this spot rather than Nasus. I get the idea of potentially, like, you in this game, you end up lane swapping him into the mid lane, trying to get him into that matchup with the Corgi, just let him scale up, try to be passive. You know, I understand the idea behind it, but I've just yet to see a Nasus pro game where, or at least in the year of 2024, where I've been like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it was worth it, right? There are so many champions that do what Nasus does, and just they can do it easier, quite frankly. And so, I don't know, I'm really not sold on the champion. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but at least for now, I'm not feeling mega confident about it. But overall, NIP being able to play through their star. And then JD Gaming, you just gotta feel bad for Ruler. I mean, what a game from him on the Jhin. If there was ever a conversation about, like, if you were ever, like, on the fence, if you're one of those people who's like, maybe Reddit's right, maybe Jhin is one of these champions that just can't do anything, that does no damage, that is a waste of a pick, or if you know somebody who is, like, you know, a big a believer in that mentality and really, you know, dislikes Jhin and thinks it's really awful and teams are throwing away wins by picking that champion, show them this game and show them Ruler trying his best to 1v9 actively. There was a real argument that Ruler was player of the game. Like, he really was that good for a majority of this. It just didn't matter because the rest of his team was running it down. But yeah, Jhin can 1v9. Like, this champion can do so much damage. He was legit one-tapping like everyone in the game by the end of it. So yeah, Jhin is really dangerous. Unfortunately, just didn't end up mattering how good Ruler was. Yagao was super fed on the Corki and did basically nothing with it besides run it down in the back half of this game. Flandre on the Garen didn't exactly get the same kind of, you know, counter matchup that we had seen players like Chovy get over in the LCK in the same situation. It's very interesting to me that Garen is kind of the go-to answer for Nasus. I don't agree with that, but I get the idea behind it. Kanavi was fine generally on the Maokai. Maybe he could have been a bit more active, but even at times he was diving the backline, like he was trying to dive Photic and he was trying to dive Leon and just wasn't really able to stick. He was dying instantly, being a bit too separated from his team, maybe a bit too much of the hero ball. And then dead of the game for me is going to go to missing. I can't remember a Leona engage this game, like, at all, that especially one that actually mattered. And so Missing's going to get it. Again, he's just been such an inconsequential player for JD Gaming over the past couple of months, and that's really not an ideal place for him to land. But JDG has to be better. They're down 0-1. If you go down 0-2, especially after you already lost a best of 5 to this team in the playoffs, I mean, you're really going to start looking bad, and the expectation of this team is going to go down tremendously. But if you can win this game to tie up the series, you can win a best of 3. Both of these teams can win a best of 3. So is this series going to get tied up, or is NIP going to take a dominant 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece. And yeah, finally, we get some back and forth action. The first series left me a bit concerned that we were going to see, I guess, another one-dimensional series. I wanted to see something interesting from these teams, and that's exactly what we are getting here. This was kind of a demolition from JDG. They were definitely better throughout basically all of this game. The moment that things broke open around 10, 15 minutes into the game in terms of some of the macro decisions that JDG was making, that was the moment that it never really felt like it was comebackable from Ninjas in Pyjamas. So credit to JDG for just kind of strangling them out. This was a very complete performance, so much so that it honestly was kind of difficult for me to pick a player of the game because I do think everybody did their part. I'm going to agree with the broadcast though, kind of side with them and give it to Flandre in the top lane. I've been decently critical of Flandre playing really at all for this team, and I think a lot of that is justified. I certainly am not taking back my thoughts that Sheer would just be an upgrade to this team in terms of what we have seen so far in 2024, but Flandre is a player that has played really well in pivotal key moments in the past. This guy's a former world champion. He is somebody who has really, really stepped up in the playoffs for previous teams and in previous situations, and so I can see why this team has so much confidence and faith that he is the guy that they should go towards in these best of 5s with their season on the line. And this was another performance that's like, okay, maybe I can understand where you're coming from with this decision. It's just a really good Renekton game. Shanji on the other side just could not do anything on the Udyr. This was a champion and a pick in general that just completely fell off, that it never should have happened in the first place, quite frankly, in terms of how this draft had gone. There's really no ways for Udyr to ever play this game, and Flandre took advantage of that, winning top lane and then completely shutting out not only Shanji, but basically every single backliner from trying to play for NIP in a lot of these 5v5s. Really nice Renekton game. But I do want to shout out Kanavi as well. This was a good Ivern game. I think there are some concerns with Ivern in a series like this where early prio matters so much, because sometimes it can be a bit difficult for Ivern to actually like skirmish and pressure because he relies so much on getting his laners ahead and then using them to win fights. But it really worked out for them in this game. I'll definitely say that. The Ivern, when it's done well, is one of the strongest champions in the entire game. We've seen that a ton out of top esports, in particular in the LPL here, but basically every team should be attempting to try and get Ivern to work, because when he does work, it's just so difficult to try to shut down anybody that ends up getting fed in the game. Yagao had a ton of gold here on the Corki. Kind of a similar game to game one for him, except he didn't make any backbreaking errors down the stretch, where, you know, in game one he was super fed and actually had quite a bit of, you know, open room, I guess, to carry some of those fights and just couldn't quite make the most of it. This game was a lot more, I guess, clean from him, and I think having the Ivern and having a really strong top laner definitely helped him out with that. Missing Ruler, they were fine as well. Certainly no negatives from them, but JDG just across the board was a lot better, a lot more consistent, and a lot stronger, especially in the mid game. You need to see their mid game step up. That's where they're supposed to be the strongest. You know, you've got Kanavi and Ruler, two of arguably the best mid game players of all time. Ruler is the king of the mid game. That's kind of what I've called him over the course of his career. And so you would imagine that they'd consistently be able to generate leads in this area, but it's nice to see it here when it matters the most. For NIP on the other side, you probably wish this game was a bit closer. You just lost the formula, right? The formula is get Rookie ahead in the mid lane on the Lucian, and that wasn't really ever going to happen this game. A lot of the action was taking place elsewhere on the map, which very much does benefit JD Gaming. If you're isolating players like Shanji, players like Fodic, then all of a sudden this game becomes a lot easier to win. If you're JDG and NIP really don't have a lot of answers to be able to combat that, because those players just aren't good enough to be able to hold up to that kind of pressure. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Shanji in the top lane. As much as this is Shanji, and trust me, it is, it's almost as much Udyr that I'm giving this dud of the game to, because what exactly is this champion supposed to do in this matchup? Like, Udyr's not this champion that I think is unpickable or unplayable in the current meta. I think that there are definitely situations where that champ can be pretty solid, pretty good, but are we really looking at this JDG draft on R5 and saying this is it? Like, this is the Udyr game? I just don't understand. Like, I don't understand the thought process behind it. Udyr seems very weak to me in this matchup, and basically everything played out as anticipated. He got behind in the early game because there was attention put into the top lane by JD Gaming, and then what was he supposed to do? Like, he walks up and immediately dies. He gets killed by the Corki, he gets killed by the Ezreal, he gets killed by the Renekton, he can't burst anybody down because of the Ivern. Like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand the idea behind this. So the Udyr ends up falling completely flat, and Shanji once again has another bad game, which has become kind of commonplace for him, unfortunately. Fodic was also very bad in this game on the MF, just constantly whiffing bullet times, being way too early. We've seen that as a general trend here in the LPL, just people being too willing to press the R button at the start of the fight. Now, it's a little bit more understandable because clearly they were trying to time up, you know, the rel engage plus the bullet time here from MF, but when Zhuo whiffs and engage, you can't just still press the R button. You have to see it land. You can't just waste every single spell that you have hoping and praying that Zhuo ends up landing the engage on rel. It's not that kind of engage. You know, I don't understand it. It feels like NIP is kind of playing on autopilot at the current moment, or at least they kind of were in game 2, and it really led to their downfall. Leon and Rookie just weren't in a position to be able to take over the game, and it slipped away from them very quickly, but the series is only tied up at 1-1. It essentially goes into a best of 3 now, which you know you can win because you've beaten JD Gaming before, and so you have to have at least some confidence going into this game number 3, but JDG definitely with more momentum coming out of that game number 2. So, as you guys know, game 3, to me, the most important game in a series when you are tied up at 1 apiece. Getting control of that series, only having to win one of the final 2 games is such a boon in a series like this. So who's going to be able to get that advantage? Well, the winner of game number 3 was JD Gaming, they are going to take game number 3. They are going to go up in this series for the first time 2-1, and they do, at the moment, look like a team that's going to be good enough to get past NIP. Through the first 3 games here, I think JDG has definitely emerged with a better strategy. Feels like NIP has very much come into this just expecting to do the same thing they did in the playoffs, and I understand the idea behind that. The meta has not shifted at all, obviously, since the playoffs ended, like, literally a day ago, and so you can't really be like, oh, we're going to change up every bit of strategy. We have this hidden tech that we didn't show off in our super deep playoff run that nobody expected us to go on. You know, I'm not expecting that from NIP, but JDG has a much clearer idea of, I think, how they want to execute with their individual players. 380 carries is obviously better than 1 in the current meta in terms of how things have worked out, but it really plays to the strengths of the players just in general that you're picking things like Smolder top. And so I really like that from this team. Of course, Flandre kind of made his name on a lot of marksmen in the top lane back in the day, and so really nice to see that continue over into a meta where that is more viable than it has been in a long time for him to still be able to pick those up and still be able to make it work. But he was not the star of this game. That is clearly Ruler in the bot lane, who is going to get player of the game. He has been amazing through the beginning part of this series, even in their game 1 loss, and I would say even especially in their game 1 loss, he has been exceptional for this team so far. The misfortune was obviously great here. He ends up, you know, 3v4ing, or 2v4ing, I should say, at the end of the game to close it out. That was really fun to watch, but even before that, he was already mega fed, and he looked really good on the MF. A lot of those bullet times were pretty solid, but honestly, a lot of what he did well in this game was genuinely just positioning well and fighting like a traditional AD carry. It's not even the Giga ultimate that ended up getting him over the finish line and getting him a bunch of kills or anything like that. The team set up for bullet times well, but it wasn't exactly this game breaker. It really was Ruler just outplaying a lot of them on Misfortune, the AD carry, which I think is really impressive to see. MF can typically, in the later half of these games, just become kind of an ultimate bot, so it's nice to see a player like Ruler show that she can still be very viable in a lot of other areas. We already talked a bit about Flandre, but I think another big difference between the two comps in this game is just how much damage JDG ends up having. It's really difficult for NIP to be able to out-damage JDG in this game. Really, their only chance was to be able to pull them apart and try to break these fights down into smaller, more bite-sized pieces with things like the Ziggs and the Cassante, but that just didn't happen. You ended up landing in these situations where you were taking a lot of front-to-back 5v5s, and you have Corki hopefully trying to break through, and JDG's got, you know, a Zeri who's scaling, a Smolder who's scaling. You have bullet time coming out from MF. Like, there's just so much to deal with for from the comp of JDG, and a big part of that is Flandre being really strong on the Smolder and getting a ton of gold in the mid-game. So, again, credit to JDG for knowing their win condition. I thought Kanavi was unbelievable in this game. I know his scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but Kanavi was excellent on the Maokai. He just plays this champion so well, and he's so aggressive. He does more damage on Maokai than basically any other jungler that I know, so really, really good game here from him. Missing was solid, probably his best game of the series. Yagao was okay on the Zeri. Overall, just a good game from JDG. Again, much closer than game 2. I want to make that clear. This wasn't like a blowout by any means, but still a very confident win from the better team here in JDG. And for NIP on the other side, things just start falling apart when they have to actually make decisions in the mid game. Things are a lot easier when they can play through things like Zyra and Brand than it is when they have to try to play around like a Ziggs bot and a Lilia, right? Like, they just don't have the decision-making in the macro to be able to maximize the output of those champions, and I think their flaws are becoming more and more clear. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Leon in the jungle. I think the only other player that you could give this to is probably Zhuo in the support position, but the Leona was just kind of useless this game for a lot of different reasons. Honestly, the support position just often runs into this spot where if you're losing, and if your team is super far behind, then you as a support can't really do anything on champions like Leona or Rel or Nautilus or Alistair or whatever, right? I think Leon was much worse in terms of his individual gameplay. I think the Lilia was just not valuable really at any point in this game. He wasn't really securing objectives. He wasn't really playing aggressive enough to fight over a lot of the tempo in the mid game. It just kind of all fell apart and fell away from Leon. I saw a lot of people saying that Leon saved NIP, that Aki was the problem. And again, I want to reiterate my thoughts on this. I'm not even necessarily saying that this team got worse or didn't get better because Leon came in, but I think that kind of binary black and white, like, either good or bad thinking is just dangerous. It's not necessarily accurate to the picture. It's very lists. Like, it doesn't, there's no context to that statement, because there is a lot more behind the scenes than just replace one player, all of a sudden the team gets better. Ninjas in Pyjamas had problems that were bigger than Aki, even if Aki was a part of those problems, and that continues to be something that we see with them moving forward. Their mid-game macro decision-making, it's not gotten better just because you took Aki out and put Leon in. So I really hate this narrative, really, about any team ever. I mean, there are circumstances, and I point those out sometimes, but I really hate this idea that, oh, replacing this one player or scapegoating this one player, like they must be the problem, because it's never that simple. Problems in League, in a 5v5 team-oriented game, they are almost never that simple. If you have the worst player in a series, oftentimes you can still do relatively well so long as you are able to hide that player well enough, and as long as you have the best player in the series, it doesn't matter, right? And so I don't know, I've just never really understood the idea that Aki was the only problem here. I think we continue to see that with their problems persisting. But Zhuo, Shanji continue to not be playing particularly well. Rookie was their one and only hope once again here, but even he couldn't salvage this game in the back half. It just wasn't particularly clean from NIP, and now they are on season point. If they lose this, they are eliminated. They are done for 2024. If they win this, we get to go to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, which would certainly be the most interesting outcome. But do they have the firepower to do that, or is JDG going to be able to close it out? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Ninjas in Pyjamas. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. That's what I wanted to see in this series. I wanted to see them fight for their lives. I wanted to see a close back and forth fun series with so much on the line. A lot of these big series can end up defaulting into one team just kind of being better than the other. When both teams are stepping up, typically it's just the one that plays and has better talent that ends up winning. It ends up not being particularly close in a lot of those instances, but we are getting a fun one here. Another game number 5 for NIP, and they have earned it. This was definitely a little bit of a pace changer, I'll say, here in game 4, because NIP just dominated the early game. Quite frankly, it wasn't particularly close until they started throwing things away in the mid game. Their mid game continues to be very sloppy. Their decision making continues to be very bad. Players getting caught out for absolutely no reason, giving a ton of gold to the enemy for no reason. You know, all of that stuff is still there. All of those problems are still very real for this NIP squad, but at the end of the day, that gigantic early lead they were able to get is enough to get them across the finish line, for them to still maintain pressure on the map throughout the entire time, and for them to get the win in game 4. Player of the game to me is going to go to Zhuo. I wanted to give this to Photic really bad for a majority of this game. He gets that solo kill on Ruler in the mid lane. He plays a lot of those early fights incredibly well to be able to set up NIP in a really good spot, but he gets caught out randomly in the mid game here. Some of those late game fights weren't exactly perfect from him on the MF, and that's just barely enough for me to put Zhuo over the top. One thing I really do want to say, though, Zhuo's really good. Like, this is a very good support player, and I think oftentimes we sometimes lose this idea that players can get better or that players can change. We were very low on Zhuo, me and the community, everybody was low on Zhuo, like at the beginning of this year, or especially going into last year when this team picked him up and assigned him as the starter. It was not really like a positive reaction, I would say, for this org, and I think that there were a lot of people questioning why the player who couldn't succeed with great talent around him on top esports was really getting this big other shot on a team like NIP that wanted to go to Worlds, and obviously very much did not work out last year, and there have been a lot of times over the course of this year where it's not necessarily worked out, but the development and the, I guess, just ability to grow that Zhuo has shown over the past year, I think is really substantial, and I think it's something that a lot of teams should be taking note of. This is not just a guy. I think he's right on par with a lot of the, you know, like 5 to 8 best supports in the LPL at the current moment in terms of what he's putting out as an aggressive playmaker, as somebody who can play enchanters if the meta ever does go back in that direction. I think Zhuo is a really interesting player. You won't hear a lot of people say that in the offseason because, as per usual, a lot of League fans have made up their mind about a player and refuse to change it regardless of whether or not the player has changed. But Zhuo very much has changed. He's a player that, you know, I was very doubtful of, and I'm not going to stick to that if I don't believe it to be true anymore. I'm really in on Zhuo. I think he's a very good support. Like I said, Photic played most of this game incredibly well. For most of this game, he was the best player in the game. A great time for him to show up. You know, typically speaking, especially historically, Photic has not been great in these high-pressure situations. It's nice to see that has kind of changed over the course of this playoff run. He was really pretty solid. I would say, I wouldn't say great for them, but good in the summer playoff run where they upset a lot of these teams, where they beat JD Gaming. They go on, to top 6. I think he was really good in that run, and he was really good in this game. He's not been perfect in this series, but he's going against Ruler, and so to have even one game where you just come out looking like the better AD carry, I think is a really good sign. Rookie was solid on the Zeri, but more notably, he didn't have to be the guy on the team for them to be able to win some of these fights, although he was the one to kind of end this game, and so there is still that. Leon was solid. I thought really good early game from him. Great pathing. That's what he's known for, but the mid-game problems still persist. Shanji continues to try to pull out this Udyr and be basically invisible, but at the end of the day, it didn't end up mattering in this one. So credit to NIP for the win, and JD Gaming is now on the back foot. We're going into a game 5, but you've lost that momentum that you generated in games 2 and 3. I'm sure this team really wanted to shut down this series and end it in 4, move on, try to figure out what they wanted to do against Weibo Gaming, but now they have to play this do or die game number 5, and the fact that they're in this situation, I think, probably has to be playing in their heads. They had an opportunity to potentially try to come back in this game after a miserable early game, mostly because NIP was just doing everything so sloppily in the mid game, but even then, you still weren't good enough to be able to fully take advantage of that. Dud of the game for me is actually going to go to Ruler in the bot lane. It just wasn't a very good Jhin game. I think this scoreline should show you that Jhin is a good champion because Ruler individually played really bad here, and a lot of the plays he ended up making were really poor. Gets solo killed, obviously, by Photic in the mid lane, but, I mean, ulting in the back of, what was it, the Herald pit? I guess it was the Grubs pit at the time, and just instantly dying. What are we doing? What's the point? I don't understand a lot of the positioning mistakes that Ruler has kind of weeded out from his spring split. They came back in this game. That cannot persist for game 5, or this team's going to be in trouble. Not like anybody else really did a whole ton here. I thought Yagao was fine. Missing was fine. Kanavi was fine. I mean, the Ivern continues to not really look all that great, and this team is severely lacking in damage when you're not going for something like a Smolder on the top side of the map, but Flandre was also significantly worse when you took him off of something that could be aggressive. I would expect this team to continue with the style that they have been playing over the past couple of games in terms of their draft, wanting to go something more supportive in the jungle and wanting to go something more aggressive on the top side. I don't agree with that ideology, but it clearly is the idea that JDG went into this series with, but it all comes down to this, a game number 5 to determine which one of these teams' season will end. The winner goes on to face Weibo Gaming. We'll talk about that later. The loser is done for 2024. So who is going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and unfortunately that means this is the end of the road for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Their 2024 has come to an end, and honestly, this is still a really good outcome for them. I know this isn't exactly what they were looking at in the preseason. We were looking at this team as a top 4, top 5 team on paper in terms of what to expect with players like Shanji and Rookie, and I really believed in someone like Aki, but the concern was always the bot lane, at least in terms of how my preseason analysis was, and a lot of things have changed since then. Leon has come in. This team went 0-9 or 0-8 or whatever they went in Group Ascend. They didn't win a single series in the regular season. They really limp their way into playoffs and figure things out with the roster change, end up making top 6 and, making a run here, but they're just not able to get past JD Gaming, who is finally starting to figure out how to play their own individual game, and it's unfortunate. We'll talk about NIP a bit more as we move along, but congrats to JD Gaming. They keep their hopes alive. Of course, I want to reiterate, this win does not mean that they are going to Worlds. It means they now have a chance to play for the chance to go to Worlds. And so they're definitely excited about that. It's just one more series after this. But player of the game here in game number 5 for me is going to go to Kanavi on the Skarner. This is a champion and a pick in general that we are seeing rise in popularity a lot right now. It was really kind of forced out of the meta after the major Skarner nerfs. It was essentially just purely a top lane champion when he first got reworked, and now he's kind of turned into this really stable jungler. I think that we will continue to see him rise in popularity. He kind of does remind me of Sejuani and Maokai and a lot of these more consistent junglers, the junglers that kind of stand the test of time and really come back in basically any meta. He really is very similar in the sense that his kit is just so inherently good that even if his numbers are, mediocre, as long as he can survive a little bit in fights, he offers so much utility that it's very much worth it to have someone like a Skarner on your team. And so Very much not surprised to see him coming back into meta. North America definitely started it, and everybody else is really starting to pick up the pace on that one. Kanavi looked unstoppable for a majority of this game. I mean, constantly getting 2, 3-man pulls and just creating so much havoc on the map. Skarner is a very difficult champion to stop once the snowball has really started going. That's definitely when things start to get a bit out of control for the champ, but a lot of really great fighting from JDG, and that's going to be reflected in my player of the series as a whole, which maybe is a bit controversial. I'm going to give it to Ruler. I don't know whether or not this is going to be a common opinion. I think Ruler was the best player in this series, at least for JD Gaming. Like, I think that Rookie was obviously great through the first couple of games, but Ruler was the one that stood out the most to me in a positive manner for JDG. Game 4 excluded. I think basically every single lead that they were able to get in their wins, you know, Ruler was a big part of that. He had the best misfortune game of the series, I think by a pretty considerable margin here in game number 5, where he was actively landing bullet times. Typically speaking, at least throughout the LPL so far, we've actually seen a lot of bullet times just go wide, but the combo of Skarner ult into bullet time or, you know, Rakan into bullet time, like, there's just so many ways to create a good opportunity for misfortune in this game, and Ruler took full advantage of it. Wasn't quite as dominant in terms of, like, the position and like the auto attack carrying kind of stuff that he was doing in game number 3, but still a really good game from Ruler overall, and again, just shows his versatility. He is my player of the series. Yagao was actually really good in this game, and I know people are really shitting on Yagao, and for the most part, I'm kind of with it. Like, Yagao has just not been very good. I don't think he's in meta. I don't think he feels comfortable with the dynamic of this team, but I do think a lot of the conversation around him is very funny. I see a lot of people being like, well, why doesn't JDG go out and get Rookie? I'm sure they would love to go out and get Rookie. Why doesn't OK Breon go out and get Faker? Like, I'm sure they would love to do that. It's a very weird conversation happening. I just don't think it was on the table when they picked up Yagao. They were hoping that Yagao and Kanavi reunited was going to give them 2022 Yagao, a player that at times, and honestly for most of 2022, was a top 10 player in the world. He was amazing. He had a career year, goes to Billy, has some struggles, but for the most part is also very good in 2023, and it just doesn't really work out this year, and that's okay. Like, Kanavi made the call to get rid of Knight for Yagao, or at least that's what the rumor is, and here we are. You know, it is what it is. Yagao just hasn't necessarily lived up to the hype, but I thought he was really good here in Game 5. Definitely his best game of the series. His least mistakes, for sure. Fondre missing, they were solid as well, but, you know, it's the key people that stepped up for JD Gaming and kind of pushed them across the finish line, and they are now moving on to take on Weibo Gaming for a chance at that number 4 seed. But for NIP, it's a really unfortunate way for your year to end because you were so close, but at the end of the day, this would have been a pretty massive upset if you were to beat them again, just because you know, JDG is one of those teams with all of these players, you would just expect them to be in the conversation. I think the expectation for NIP was significantly lower, especially after going winless in Group Ascend, and so just being in the regional qualifier is probably already looked at as a pretty big sign for this org. Dead of the game in Game 5 is going to go to Rookie. I know it feels pretty bad to do that because he's like the only player actually trying on NIP. At least he was the only player playing consistent at all throughout the year, but he wasn't very good at all. Got completely outplayed by Yagao for a majority of the back half of this game. I get it's Corki versus Lucian. One of those champions is just going to have more damage than the other in terms of a lot of these fights, but I have to call it as I see it, and that's just kind of the reality. But Rookie was trying things, and I'm certainly not trying to sit here and say that Rookie was like the problem for the team in this series. I think Leon really was a non-factor in basically every game. Like, he was able to get first blood and then did absolutely nothing after that. That's the Leon we all know and love. That's the Leon that I think has become a little bit infamous in the LPL community. Great job in the first 5 minutes and then literally nothing after that, especially macro-wise. It just continued to be a problem. The Nasus probably was the most effective it's ever been, at least from what I've seen in Pro. It really was kind of a problem, but for the most part, it stopped being a problem as soon as JDG acknowledged that it was a bit of a problem. He gets a triple kill in the fight around Dragon, and then basically from that point onwards, the Nasus can't really do anything, because then JDG realizes, oh, we just don't allow him to walk up. Like, as long as we don't let him do that, there's literally nothing the Nasus can do to stop us, and then he became significantly less effective. Zhuo with the Flex Maokai in the support position. I thought his ults were fine, but generally tempo was lost very early on. There's just not a lot you can do. Photic was just kind of along for the ride. Wasn't doing a ton of damage, but also, like, it's Varus. Like, he was not asked to be the #1 carry this game for this team. NIP had, you know, a very clear direction, and that revolved around Rookie, and unfortunately, that's just not enough. You can't be a one-player team in the LPL and expect to succeed, especially against a team like JD Gaming, and they stepped up in the end. So, for NIP, it's an unfortunate way for your year to end, but I'm sure you're looking back on it and saying that they did the best best that they could, and for JDG, the story is not over. We now go on to take on Weibo Gaming, and we'll see how that ends up happening. We're going to cover that in just a second, but they have their shot. Let's see if they can make it worthwhile and see if they can kind of turn around the narrative that they have disappointed so far in 2024. But then moving on to our third and final series of the video, and this is the final series of the LPL season here domestically. This is it. This will determine our fourth and final seed from the LPL at Worlds this year, and of course, which team is the final team eliminated. It's a matchup between the number 3 seeded Weibo Gaming and the number 6 seeded JD Gaming, and we've already talked about both of these teams, so the preview is going to be much shorter. I don't have to explain kind of the styles or the individual tendencies of these teams and how I generally feel about them going into this, because you already know. I just covered Weibo's loss to LNG. I just covered JDG's win over Ninjas in Pyjamas, and so we can just go ahead and talk about how they individually interact with each other. I think that there are a lot of interesting matchups to monitor in a series like this, none more important than mid lane. Xiaohu taking on Yagao. Both of these players have at times been scapegoats for their individual teams. I continue to believe that they are the defining members in terms of whether or not these teams succeed or fail because of how flippy they have been. Xiaohu at times has been the worst mid laner in the LPL so far in 2024. There were definitely stretches at the beginning of the summer split where things were just a disaster for him. And even in this good run for Weibo that they've been on that brought them to finals, he's not exactly been the pinnacle of consistency. And so there is some concern there, but everybody's also very out on Yagao. And so you end up in this situation where if one of these mid laners ends up playing really well in this series and actually just kind of dominates and puts their team on their back, that could be it. Like, that could genuinely immediately be the end of the series, and that could determine who ends up winning it. But outside of that, you've got Tarzan taking on Kanavi, two of the best junglers in the world. At the current moment, you've got Light and Crisp taking on Ruler and Missing, two very consistent AD carries that might not have had their career highs over the course of this year, with some really inconsistent support play. Two top laners that have shown some really good things and some really bad things. Honestly, these two teams are very, very similar in terms of roster at the current moment, but they're opposite in terms of playstyle. Weibo Gaming is incredibly fast, they're incredibly aggressive, and they really play off of their jungle, whereas JD Gaming, while they do play off of their jungle, a lot of it is very slow, it's a lot more methodical, and it's very much towards the mid game, whereas Weibo really wants to get ahead in the early game. And so I do think a lot of those timers are going to matter if Weibo falls into the trap that they fell into against LNG, where they just can't actually get early game leads, where you're going into the mid to late game even, and the other team's just better in that phase of the game. I think they could actually be in some trouble in a series like this. But for JDG, the game plan is very simple. It's slow the pace down. If you get into this all-out brawl, this skirmish fest with Weibo Gaming, you're probably not going to come out on top. You just don't really seem to have the firepower at the current moment with your current team. I think on paper, JD Gaming feels like the better team right now to send to Worlds, but Weibo Gaming obviously was on such a hot streak. I think this really is a 50-50. If I was a betting man, I would never in a million years bet on a series like this. But the only way to know how this series does end up going is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series. And this is kind of what we were talking about. This is a game that continues to delay and delay and delay and just go longer and longer and longer. And eventually, I mean, look at JDG's comp. Eventually, they just hit this break point where they can no longer lose the game. They end up getting Smolder super online. Ezreal is really, really strong throughout a majority of this game. You've got a Maokai for zone control. You've even got a Nasus to be able to pressure side lanes and to fight, early on in these fights to really kind of create havoc so that Smolder and Ezreal have more room to operate. There's just a lot of tools at JDG's disposal in the back half of this game that Weibo's just not able to answer. To their credit, I think they tried their best to keep things interesting. This wasn't exactly a perfect game from JDG, but they made it count. Their picks were the ones that ended up being more influential, and that's why they came out on top. Player of the game is pretty obviously, to me, going to go to Ruler in the bot lane on this Ezreal. This was a terrific Ezreal game. He was constantly in the right place at the right time, and this is very much a carryover from the previous series, where for most of the games, his positioning was about as perfect as it could get. You once again got that here. The aggression level that Ruler offers that other players just don't. It's very, very different. You just don't find players like this very frequently in a lot of these leagues, and so you end up in situations where Ruler is just able to take over the map in ways that other teams aren't prepared for. His mid game is literally perfect, but it was his late game team fighting that really separated himself in this one. Just a great performance from one of the best players in the world who is really rising to the occasion at the right time. But I want to give a big shout out to Yagao. I know he's kind of scapegoated on this team, and I agree. Like, I know I've said it a couple of times in this video. I'm not even really all that against the narrative that he has been kind of a bit of an albatross for this team. However, we got to point out his good performances. Like, we have to show, like, love when it does work out, when he does give us the things that we're asking for, and that's what happened here in game number 1. He wasn't exactly the driving force on the Smolder, but that's not the job of the champion. Your job when you play Smolder is not to be the one that's creating a lot of action for the team. It's to follow up on the action that is created, and that's exactly what he did. The damage he was able to output in the back half of these fights, in the back half of this game, it was ginormous, and it ended up leading into this situation where JDG just could not lose a 5v5 team fight. They had significantly too much damage, and even if Ruler was a little bit better, in my opinion, I still think Yagao deserves a lot of mentions for being as good as he was. I think Kanavi was really good this game on the Maokai. Flandre was pretty solid. Unfortunately, Dud of the Game is actually going to stay on the winning side of the map. Very rare that I do this, but I'm going to give Dud of the Game to Missing. I continue to be very concerned with his individual performances. There were multiple parts of this game where he is just getting caught out over and over and over again, and quite frankly, there were moments in the mid-game where it felt like he was actively going to lose JDG the game. Now, some of those, like, catches, quote-unquote catches, like Missing getting caught in Upper River right before Baron, end up leading to JDG fight wins anyways because they're incredibly strong, and, you know, Weibo has to overextend to kill the Leona, but still the point remains, like, he needed to be in better positions for a majority of this game, and he just straight up wasn't. So certainly something to monitor there, but yeah, I just feel good about JDG. I feel good about this win. I think they have a very good idea of how they want to play out some of these games, especially in the back half, and they are way more clinical than Weibo Gaming. So even if you get in these situations where Weibo does relatively okay in the early section, they just can't really hang on to that pressure unless that lead is tremendous. And that's the problem for Weibo, is that no matter what happens, if you're going into the mid to late game, I just cannot count on this team to actually close out a game, or especially try to play out a game from even and generate their own lead in that section. I think it's just a bit of a lost cause at that point, if we're being honest. Dud of the Game obviously went to JDG, and so there's nobody to talk about for that on Weibo's side, but there are some players to criticize. I mean, Crisp at times had some bad engages. I think he also had some really good ones, which is why he didn't get Dud of the Game. I think there are some real criticisms about Breathe, where it's just like, man, you got to be more aggressive with those Kennen ultimates. Oftentimes he was trying to settle for protecting not only himself, but, you know, the rest of his team. He was kind of failing to try to find those flank angles. Maybe that was a team effort. Maybe that was something that they put in and were like, hey, we don't necessarily want you to be as aggressive this game. We want you to pull back and be a little bit more safe. I don't really know. I don't know what the decision was there, but I don't think Breathe did nearly enough in this game. Xiaohu was caught out a couple of times on the Tristana in the back half here. That really cost them, even if he was doing quite a bit of damage in the mid game. I thought Tarzan was pretty good, and Light was really good here on the Ashe. In fact, a couple of phenomenal Ashe arrows. I feel bad for Light because he actually had a really good game number 1. It just didn't end up mattering. JD is just a little bit more consistent and a little bit cleaner in terms of their execution, and if that continues, if that holds, then that's a problem for Weibo Gaming, because they don't really have ways to win outside of just brute force. Now, brute force is a pretty good strategy if you can get there, but JDG is not exactly a pushover mechanically early in games, and so right now I'm feeling pretty good about JDG, but Weibo has the chance to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and then everything gets a lot more interesting as per usual. Are they going to be able to tie it up at 1 apiece, or is JDG going to get that dominant 2-0 series lead and put themselves 1 game away from qualifying for Worlds once again? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and JD Gaming, what are we doing? We had a clear game plan, we had a clear identity, and it all got thrown out the window here in game number 2. I'm not really sure what the thought process was for them going into this game, but I think they just got a little bit too much confidence under their belt, because they went into game number 2 and said, you know, that strategy that we had where we're going to slow the pace of the game down, and where we're going to draft Nasus and Zeri and Maokai and play for a lot of these late game team fights, and that's really worked for us, and Weibo has in particular really struggled with a style like that. Well, what if we just skirmished every single chance that we got before 10 minutes. And that's what they did. They went for skirmish after skirmish, trade after trade, and guess what? Weibo Gaming's better at that, and they came out on top in the early game. They were able to snowball the game out of control, and all of a sudden, it's over. I just don't understand. From JD Gaming, this should be so simple to execute, and yet it just doesn't feel like they can wrap their heads around it. It feels like they are constantly pulled in the direction of feeling like they have to ego check every single team that they run into, and this is a continuous problem for them, something that they have struggled with all year long. It's the reason Weibo has consistently been able to beat JD Gaming. It's just very strange for me. I don't really understand why they're running into this issue, but they are. And for Weibo, like, of course, they took advantage of it. They did really well in this game because they were able to play their own style and their own game. They were able to skirmish a lot and play really high tempo, and all of a sudden you can see guys like Xiaohu and Crisp and even Breathe to an extent look a lot more comfortable, and you're still getting good performances out of Tarzan and Light, who were already playing really well. And so now you're just in a position where, yeah, this is a really easy win. This is a sub 24-minute win over JD Gaming. Player of the game for me is going to go to Crisp. This is the kind of game that Crisp excels in, where he's just constantly moving around the map and trying to skirmish. One of the things that he does best is look for interesting flank angles, and he's probably the most creative support in terms of engages in the world. And so when you get these weird game states where everyone's constantly trying to find picks and constantly trying to skirmish around objectives, having a player like that can actually create these weird angles, all of a sudden things become a lot more interesting for Weibo than they do for JD Gaming. And I think that was a big positive in this game, obviously, for Weibo Gaming. I think one thing that I also want to point out, and Crisp has a lot to do with this, but this is just generally a Weibo thing. A lot of the time when you hear like someone like me or any other analyst say, oh, Weibo Gaming's really good in the early game, but if they don't get that lead, then they're not really great at ending games. They're not really great at playing from behind. Oftentimes that statement can be misconstrued into like me saying they have bad macro. I don't, those two things are not the same. Like those are not equal. You can see that this team has good macro, that they know what they're supposed to do. The problem is that a lot of the decisions that they make don't work nearly as well when they're in really big negative gold states. When they have an early lead, they are one of the hardest teams to beat in the world, and that is good macro. Like that is a good understanding of where you should put your resources. It's not a complete team, it's not a versatile team, and that is a problem, especially when you're going up against some of the other best teams in the world. But blanket statements like Weibo Gaming have bad macro, I don't agree with that. I think they're very similar. Honestly, this is a weird comparison, but they're very similar to Fnatic in that regard, where so long as you keep them comfortable and don't take them out of their comfort zone, except, of course, against G2, where all of this falls apart for Fnatic, the comparison at least, but as long as you keep them in their comfort zone, they're gonna be really good at everything in the game. The problem is when that comfort zone is destroyed, then they start to lose confidence in their own plays, and they start to go against their own macro decisions, and that's when things start to fall apart. I think it's very similar for Weibo, and that's why players like Crisp and Xiaohu and Breathe play a lot better from ahead, because when they're able to very cleanly execute the things they know how to do, all of a sudden the game gets a lot easier. It's simplified, and they're not really in these positions where they have to make these hero plays. So Crisp was really good here. Light was also excellent on the Ashe. He was the one they were really enabling in the early game, or at least, attempting to enable. Xiaohu was actually the one who got super fed from the triple kill in the fight, like the skirmish near, I believe it was First Dragon. Maybe it was even before that. It was in Bot River, but Light was the one that they were intentionally trying to give a ton of resources to, and the Ashe was really good this game. Basically no missed arrows. I mean, this guy is just so consistent, and he really does step up when it matters the most for all of his teams. That included LNG. Tarzan was really good here. Breathe hit some really good ultimates. He was much more aggressive in this game. Again, going back to this idea that as long as the reins are off, he actually starts to play really good League of Legends. It's just the case for Weibo Gaming. When they put themselves in these positions where they're allowed to play confident and comfortable, they are the best versions of themselves. When they have to play methodical and when they have to try and be patient, it's not really playing to the strengths of what this team does. And so getting early leads has been paramount, and that's why it's so frustrating to watch JD Gaming just duel them over and over again with Nasus, Maokai, Zeri as a comp. I just don't really understand how I could possibly make it more clear that this team needs to thrive on slowing the pace of the game down. Everyone has been saying this. This isn't some like channel secret. This isn't something that I've noticed that nobody else has. Everybody knows that this is Weibo's win condition. Everybody knows that this is how this team likes to play the game. And for JDG to just willingly play into that, into a comp that is just better at it than yours, it doesn't really make a lot of sense in my head. It's just a complete lapse in judgment, and I think it goes on quite a few players. I'll get to Kanavi in a second, because honestly, I think he's a big reason why JDG lost this game in particular with his decisions. But dud of the game is going to go to Yagao. Just some really, really bad play here. It's really sad because I was really starting to feel good about Yagao. Game 5 was really good. Game 1 here was really good. And you're like, okay, Yagao is settling in and he's starting to get to a point where he can feel comfortable playing around these players again in this new role. But then a game like this comes around and all of that kind of falls apart again. And it's been the consistency that's been a problem for him. And so I just don't trust him right now. And he's going to get done of the game here. But Kanavi made game-losing decision after game-losing decision. And I just don't think I can, accept this. He is too smart of a player to do this. I get that early game leads are kind of his thing. He is the jungler that you most trust getting a lead pre-10 minutes. That's just kind of the thing that he's done over the course of his whole career. But this is not the series, and he should know that. He is too experienced, and quite frankly, he's too good to not understand how to play to his own win condition when he's playing Maokai with Nasus and Zeri. I think it's a really, really bad game from JDG, and it really concerns me. And now the series is tied up at 1 apiece. If JDG can't learn from this and get back to some of the things that were working for them, that could be a problem, because as long as Weibo's in their comfort zone, they are going to win this series. End of story. That's just how the team operates. The way to beat them is to take them out of that. And so you need to do that here in game 3. Going down 2-1 after basically giving them game number 2 is not going to be a good feeling. But for Weibo, you've figured out the formula. You have been shown the light. Capitalize on that. Continue to pressure them and force them into the mistakes that they made here in game 2. If you do that 2 more times, you're going to Worlds. So a big game number 3, the most important game of the series, as you guys know. So who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1. I'm really excited for this team. I'm really proud of the direction that they are going in, because it feels like they've really capitalized on the things they're doing well. The coaching staff has very clearly identified what to play into and what not to play into in terms of ideology. And even if I don't love the draft from their perspective, I like it significantly less from JD Gaming's perspective, and we saw that more as the game continued to play out. And so for Weibo, I feel really good about them coming out of this game. There are a couple of players that are just completely on fire right now. Cough, cough, the bot lane for Weibo, who is just lighting it up through games 2 and 3, and really game 1 as well for Light. And I'm really, really excited to see if they can keep that momentum up. But for JDG, just calm down. I mean, truly, seriously, I understand that you had a gold lead for a majority of this game. I understand that for a lot of this, it felt like JDG was in a decent spot. But really, when you look at the map state of the game, JDG picked up all their gold in the early game. Unless they were able to actively win a front-to-back 5v5 in the late game against Weibo Gaming, they were never actually going to be able to win this game. And I just didn't have confidence that they were going to be able to do that with this draft. And I know that there are realistic reasons to expect that could be possible if Ruler was popping off, which he was for a lot of this game. If Yagao was able to get really fed, which he up for debate in this game at times, then I think there is a world in which JDG can win the front to back, but they were not in the same kind of lead that you would expect from the gold lead that they had for a majority of this game. This very much was Weibo's tempo, and they capitalized on it. Again, my phrase with Weibo is not you have to not skirmish with them early, or you have to come out of the early game with a lead against Weibo. That's not the phrasing that I want to be captured. My phrasing is you have to take them out of their comfort zone. That's what I talked about a lot in game 2, and that's not what happened here. Weibo felt comfortable the entire game, even at a gold deficit, and so when they get into these small sections where 1 or 2 things going wrong can completely change the outcome of the game as a whole, Weibo's more comfortable in the situation. All of a sudden, they end up winning the game. I want to give a lot of credit to Light and Crisp because they were fantastic. The bot lane really is the carry right now for Weibo, and it's not even really all that close. Light played out of his mind here in game 3. He's been amazing through all 3 games so far, even their loss in game number 1. This really is kind of an AD carry duel. Ruler has been exceptional for JDG, and Light has been exceptional for Weibo. Really cool to see both of these guys step up when it matters the most, but Light was just a little bit better. Those bullet time plus Magnet Storm combos coming out of the bot lane were unstoppable for a lot of the game, and even when they would whiff the combo, even when they wouldn't get the engage quite right, Light was still doing a ton of damage on the MF as a straight AD carry. We're seeing that be even a little bit more relevant than it was at times in the regular season. Oftentimes we saw MF kind of devolve into this R-bot towards the back half of games, basically for everybody in the LPL playoffs, and that's not how she's been played so far. I think players are stepping up and really kind of maximizing the damage output on her. We're seeing a lot more close quarters fights around big objectives, and that's really where MF thrives, not only because of the R, but obviously because of the Q as well. So really like how Light was able to play this. Ruler was exceptional, but Light was just a little bit better. And Crisp, I mean, this was an exceptionally great game from Crisp as well. I think he's going to go under the radar for just how good he was here, but when this team wins, again, when he's comfortable, he's genuinely still one of the best supports in the world. Now, that's significantly less common than it is for players like Light or like Tarzan on this team, but when he is in that zone, when he is just able to make a lot of these fun engages and try to set up the whole team, be the go button for them, he is really, really good in that role, and he still can be world class. The tape is there. The inconsistency does bother me a bit, but it's really hard to overlook how good the good games are, and I think that that's definitely something to keep note of. Everybody else was still good. Another decent game of Nasus here. The champion didn't really do much, but Breathe was effective in the later fights. Tarzan, Xiaohu, I think were generally fine. Xiaohu was caught a couple of times, big shocker. Tarzan had a few more deaths than maybe you would like, but that's because he was so aggro in this game. Probably the most aggro I've ever seen a Maokai play, and it really worked out for Weibo. Overall, I'm just really a fan of them understanding what they are comfortable doing and just sticking to that. This is a series that you have to win. Don't try to go out and impress anybody. You just have to do the things you need to do to get across that finish line. And for JDG, you're keeping Weibo Gaming in their comfort zone, and it's really taking you out of this series. I really have a bone to pick with how Kanavi is playing right now. He's going to get done of the game. I think he has, I'm not going to say single-handedly lost games 2 and 3, because I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's necessarily accurate towards the story, but he is the primary decision maker early on for this team, and every decision he has made has put this team back. And generally, I think if they had just stuck to the game plan, obviously with the draft in game number 2, and then, you know, what we all thought the draft should have been here in game number 3, then this team is maybe in a better spot, but that's not the case. You have a gold lead going into the late game. You end up not being able to successfully hold on to that because you're just getting picked off, and you're taking a lot of these skirmishes, and you take all your objectives super early, so you don't really have a lot of standing gold on the map to keep getting stronger, and all of a sudden the game slips out of your hands. It doesn't feel like the kind of team that we've been talking about being this really smart mid or late game team that should be able to slow the pace down. It feels like a team that doesn't really have a great sense of direction or identity, and that's the biggest concern that I have for JD Gaming, is that they are losing that direction and they are losing that identity. Kanavi is my dud of the game, but Flandre, nothing. Missing, nothing. It's these players that have to step up that just aren't stepping up right now. Yagao, again, a lot of mistakes in the back half of the game, even if he is good at getting resources, and Ruler was amazing. I mean, for most of this game, he was actively trying to 1v9, but it just doesn't matter. You can only do so much as Ashe if the rest of your team can't do anything, and that's unfortunately the situation that JDG is falling into right now. They feel very fraudulent watching these games, and now they are one game away from having their 2024 end, and that's a really bad position for them to be in. They really wanted to go to Worlds. The expectation for this team was to go to Worlds. It's not out of your hands just yet, but you have to click it into gear. For Weibo Gaming, they have the chance to close this out in 4, which I'm sure they would love to do, but JD Gaming has to push this to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or else they are done. Are they going to keep it alive, or is Weibo Gaming going to be our 4th and final representative from the LPL at Worlds? Well, the winner of game number 4 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2-2, and we are going to a defining Silver Scrapes game number 5. The final game of the LPL split in 2024 will be a game 5. That's what I'm talking about. This is the dream, and wouldn't you know it, who is shocked? JD Gaming slows down the pace. We don't get a kill until like 10 minutes into the game, and all of a sudden, Weibo starts forcing things, starts putting themselves in bad positions, and really feels like they have to push the tempo when they're really not in a bad spot. When you take Weibo out of their comfort zone, they don't know what to do, even if it's good for them. You might look at this draft and go, well, JDG being passive in the early game, that's not really ideal for them. You've got Renekton, you've got Misfortune, you've got a lot of these lanes that should have priority and pressure, but it doesn't matter. Like, Weibo is going to make a mistake if you just slow the pace of the game down. If you say, hey, we're totally fine, like, not fighting and just letting this passively go into the mid game, their brains explode. They can't handle that. And so allow them to beat themselves. That is the strategy against Weibo Gaming, and JDG finally got back to that here in game number 4. I know it sounds like I'm a bit exasperated, but that's because I kind of am, because this should have been the strategy from the start. This should have been easy for them. It hasn't been, but I'm glad we got there. Player of the game in game 4 is once again going to go to Ruler. He is playing out of his mind in this series right now, regardless of whether or not JDG ends up winning this. Ruler deserves all of the flowers in the world for trying his best to get this team to the World Championships. This guy does not want to miss Worlds, and missing Worlds would be very weird for a player like Ruler. He has been so dominant for so long that having a year where it's even kind of up in the air, it's very much a surprise, and I think he understands that, and that's why he has shown up so big in this series and been such an influencing figure into why JDG are in such a good spot, or at least in this series at all, going to a game number 5. Without Ruler, this series is over. The series was over a long time ago. The bullet times were great, the damage was great, his late game team fighting was great, just generally always in a good area. He was the one to get Soul this game, you know, just everything going right for Ruler. He's always in the right place at the right time, and he has a great understanding of exactly how to utilize that champion to look great. Misfortune's been a major pick over the course of this regional qualifiers, as I'm sure you've noticed over the course of this video, but no one plays it better than Ruler. I mean, he just dominates on this champion. I do want to give a big shout out to Kanavi. I very narrowly gave him player of the game. I think he was way better here. This is easily his best game of the series up until this point, and they desperately needed it to happen now. Again, slowing the pace of the game down, forcing Tarzan and Crisp to come to him and make their own mistakes, walk to their own deaths. That's what really enabled JDG to start the snowball. And then the moment that Weibo Gaming had to start playing from behind, they were taking bad fights and not necessarily in good positions. Now, JD Gaming's macro wasn't exactly perfect, and part of that does fall on Kanavi individually as a player, but for the most part, I can forgive some of the macro mistakes because everything else was going well. Flandre, Yagao, missing, they were all good. People are still going to criticize Yagao. I think he was fine in this game, but missing in particular was probably the third piece for this team. But it's Kanavi and Ruler that stepped up when they needed it the most, and who's really surprised about that? It's the stars of the team that are coming up clutch when they need it, and for Weibo, you gotta get your head on straight. It is okay for you to pick Maokai plus Zeri plus Gnar, hell even plus Ziggs, and be passive in the early game. It is okay for that to happen, but this team gets so antsy, they get so fidgety when things aren't happening on the map that they then go and force these awful plays that put them at deficits. Now, it could have been worse this game. They were only down like 1 or 2k gold because of their bad decisions at like 15 minutes, but there was a real possibility that if JDG was playing a bit better, this could have immediately turned into a 3-4k gold deficit, and the game is over instantly, and you don't have the chances that you have in the back half of this game to get back into it. And so I really just, I don't have a lot of faith in Weibo Gaming, if I'm being entirely honest with you. This team has such a critical flaw in their system that they just can't seem to weed out. Tarzan is going to get dud of the game. He is a big reason why that problem exists. He's not the only reason why, because the switch up from playstyles from what he was last year on LNG and that really slow teamfight-oriented player to now being the most aggressive jungler in the LPL, that switch up happened because Weibo was not winning at the beginning of the split, because the team was looking so horrible. He progressively got more and more aggressive because he realized that was the only thing that he could do to actually salvage the team's season, and it very much worked. But it is a double-edged sword, and you're going to have games like you did here in game number 4 as the Maokai, where things just don't go right, where you're constantly in bad positions and you're constantly getting caught out. And so that's what happened, and he deserves dead of the game. But Crisp is not far behind him. His feast or famine nature has been perfectly exemplified in this series because games 2 and 3 were unbelievably good from him, and games 1 and 4 have been problematic from him. And so you end up landing in this spot where you don't know which version of Crisp you're going to get in a deciding game number 5. You've got Light, who can't really do much here on the Ziggs. You have Breathe and Xiao, who both had good and bad moments. Breathe gets a solo kill in the bot lane and then is entirely useless for the rest of the game. Xiao, who looks pretty good in some of these fights, but then oversteps and mispositions just enough to give JDG like the space to kill him. It's just these small micro errors that end up being their problem, but that's the thing they're bad at, the small stuff. Weibo Gaming as a team, basically everybody across the board, with really the exception of Light, is really bad at the small things, like the things that aren't quite as noticeable, the little micro decisions that they make along the way. That's why they need those early leads. That's why they need to be in their comfort zone, because then you can negate or mitigate at the very least a lot of the problems that are created from those micro decisions. And so Here we are. It's game number 5. It's the final game of the LPL in 2024, and the winner will go to Worlds. The loser is done. It's Weibo Gaming, JD Gaming. Who is going to be the number 4 seed from the LPL? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and your final LPL representative at the 2024 World Championships will be Weibo Gaming. Congratulations to them, but on the flip side, that means that the year is over for one of the premier organizations coming out of the LPL in JD Gaming. They will be the final team eliminated, and they will not be making the 2024 World Championships. If you told me that at the beginning of the year, I honestly would have believed you, but that has more to do with the LPL than it does with JDG's roster. There is no reason that this team should not be making Worlds. I think that my belief at the beginning of the year going into the LPL is that one of my top 3, if not 2 of my top 3 are, guaranteed to miss Worlds. There's just never been a time. Specifically, the number 2 spot in my preseason power rankings seems mega cursed, and JDG was the number 2 spot in my preseason power rankings. I don't know why that's become a trend, but it's just kind of funny how that ends up working out. But as a whole, I think JDG is going to look back on this year, unfortunately, probably very disappointed. I think it's always unfortunate to be like the 5th best team in your region and be like, oh, we sucked. Like, that sucks. That's a horrible thing to do. Because in a region like the LPL where there are so many teams, like, getting 5th best really isn't, like, horrible. In the grand scheme of things, I think contextually it's really not horrible, but the expectation for JDG was just so much higher. If Weibo had lost this game and lost this series, I honestly think I would have been like, honestly, with everything that happened with Weibo this split, 5th is a pretty good outcome. The same thing I said for NIP. Like, making this tournament at all was a really good outcome for Ninjas and Pyjamas, considering how a lot of the split went. But for JDG, I just don't feel the same. Unfortunately, I think the expectations were just too high. And for them to miss Worlds, for Kanavi and Ruler and Missing and Flandre and Yagao and this group of veterans, for all of them to miss Worlds, it's really not an ideal set of circumstances. But I don't want that to take anything away from the celebration that Weibo Gaming should have. This is a team that went to World Finals last year as the number 4 seed out of the LPL. They are not unfamiliar with being like underdogs going into this tournament and overperforming, and a lot of that, I guess, surprise factor is very much still there. This was the one game where it really felt like Weibo Gaming kind of played outside of their own style and ended up actually winning it. Through the first 4 games, I think it went very according to plan, where the slower games were in favor of JDG and the faster games were in favor of Weibo. This was a slower game, and yet Weibo was still a lot more clinical in terms of the execution, and I think a lot of it comes down to JD Gaming just not really having their head in the game, something just being off in terms of their decision-making. Weibo was able to get a couple of leads, and from that point onwards, it was gone. The game was over. A big credit, though, to my player of the game and my player of the series. No-brainer. This is going to Light in the bot lane. I mean, like a defining series here from Light. He has been a really good player for a lot of teams for a really long time. I really stuck my neck out for him in 2022. That was the year where I was talking about him as like a top 3 to 580 carry in the world when he was playing for that LNG team with Doenby and Tarzan, and they were just not clicking. Like, that mid-jungle duo just wasn't working out, and I was like, Light is dragging this team across the finish line. He almost single-handedly dragged that team to Worlds. If you haven't watched 2022 Light, please go and watch that tape. It's like unbelievable. It's the best he's ever played in his entire career. Last year, I was really in on him as well, but I was more in on Crisp. I thought of the bot lane duo, Crisp was the one that I was more impressed by. Light was kind of the consistent piece, the stable piece of a Weibo team that was very inconsistent, but he was amazing in their World Finals run. When you're talking about the players that stepped up at the World Championships, obviously the Shy gets a lot of credit because he deserves it. He was the best player on Weibo during that run, but because of that, I think people really underrate just how good Light was at Worlds. Like, genuinely one of the best AD carries at the entire tournament. And now, in a situation where it's do or die, you either make Worlds or you go home, he steps up, and throughout this entire series, he is undeniable. He is a clutch performer. He is somebody who really steps his game up when it matters the most. And honestly, Light has become one of my favorite players in the world. There's just no other way to say it. He's not always going to be the most flashy, but sometimes he is. Go watch these games on Ashe. He's hitting every arrow from across the entire map. He seals the series by hitting an arrow onto Ruler from basically halfway across the bot lane, just into the mid lane, perfectly timed onto the Misfortune to get her picked off, and that's the game. Instant, done, it's over. Like, Light is just so clinical. His veins must be ice cold because he doesn't rattle under pressure. He's one of the few players in League of Legends that genuinely always amplifies his performance the more important the game is, and that's just something you really have to admire. He is an incredible player. Crisp was also excellent in this team's wins, especially on Rel. That's really a champion that I think he really excels on, but he can do it on basically any engager. I just think Rel has a lot of tools and is the best engager in the game right now, but Crisp is a great player when he's locked in and when the team is playing well. Obviously, he's just very flippy. In the bad games, you're gonna have to excuse the bad games because the rest of the team is losing. In the good games, he looks amazing. Tarzan, I mean, come on, man. Like, what do you want me to say? Tarzan made Worlds, and half the LPL subreddit is crying their eyes out right now, saying that it's not fair, that Tarzan is undeserving or whatever. I'm obviously a massive Tarzan defender. He has been a long-time channel darling, I would say. Certainly somebody that I was praising for a while. I mean, 2021 LNG was nothing without Tarzan. I think that was the roster with him and Icon and you know that version of LNG. Like, that's where he really became a game breaker in my eyes, where it just was undeniable how good he was. Obviously, not everything has clicked throughout every year of his career, but when he is working, when he is like playing well, he's one of the best junglers like in the world. He's certainly one of the most mechanically talented junglers in the world, and the spirit of Griffin continues to live on. Breathe, Xiaohu even were fine in this series. Xiaohu certainly could have been a bit more clinical. Breathe is always somebody that I think could be a bit more clinical, but congrats to Weibo Gaming. They've earned it. But for JDG, man, it just sucks. Like, the narrative around this team was like first place or bust going into the year because they almost had the golden road last year. They win the LPL spring split, they win MSI, they win the summer split, they lose to T1 in the semifinals at Worlds, and you make some pretty drastic roster changes. The best player in the league is out. Knight is out, and you are the one who made that decision. You had Knight under contract, but you wanted Yagao. You thought it would upgrade your team. You thought playing for Kanavi, playing for Ruler, having a mid laner who was quote-unquote more of a supportive mid laner, somebody who's more willing to be a team player rather than Knight, who is typically more of a resource carry. You wanted to make that decision. It didn't necessarily work out. Top lane obviously changed as well. 369 goes back to top esports, plays really well for a majority of the year. You bring in Flandre, and you also bring in this young kid in Sheer. You can never really figure out who you want to start, unfortunately. That doesn't work out. 369 was better. Missing regressed quite significantly over the course of this year. There were just a lot of factors that led to JDG not making Worlds, and even then, they were still just one game away because that's how good Ruler is. And, you know, I feel bad for him. Like, it's gotta suck. Ruler is one of those players that just doesn't miss Worlds. Even Kanavi, like, to this point, is somebody that has very rarely missed Worlds ever since he kind of broke through in 2020. He missed 2021, I believe, but he's been there every year since, and so it's just going to be strange to see this team not at the World Championships, but there are so many positives to take away from this. I think Yagao is being scapegoated way too much. I genuinely don't think he was really that big of a problem in this series, at least in comparison to some of the other, you know, players that we've seen run it down in best of fives in the past. I think missing was a bigger problem for this team. He just could never find any form or consistency. Flandre's my dud of the game. He did literally nothing here in game number 5. The Renekton was entirely useless. Kanavi really struggled in this team's losses. Ruler was the constant. He's the one player that you genuinely, you give a lot of respect to because he played his heart out and he gave it his best effort, but again, it just wasn't enough. I feel bad for JD Gaming, but you know, we'll see what they do going into next year. They are obviously not going to be running this 5 back. This is a massive disappointment. I would be shocked if this team doesn't make major changes. I don't know what those are going to be just yet. I don't know who's going to want to stick around or whether or not this team might go through a rebuilding process. We've seen teams be on the cusp before. Teams like Edward Gaming and RNG and just decide to tear it down and blow it up. I really don't want JDG to do that, but it might be out of their control if players want to leave. So we'll see what happens in the offseason for them. But like I said, congratulations to Weibo Gaming. They have officially qualified for the 2024 World Championships. And honestly, with as much as this team has had to go throughout basically all of this year, all of the ups and downs, I don't know if there are many more teams in the world that are more deserving of it right now than Weibo. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Regional Finals video. Up on the screen, the 4 representatives from the LPL going to the World Championships. The number 1 seed goes to Billy Gaming. The number 2 seed goes to Top Esports. The number 3 seed to LNG Esports. And the number 4 seed to Weibo Gaming. I'm incredibly proud of these teams. These are the 4 teams that I wanted to see at Worlds from the LPL. I think these are the 4 that make it the most interesting, but you know, you would already know that. If you've watched all of the videos, we have gone through everything. This is the final LPL video of the year of 2024. The domestic league is over. And I just want to say, if you've been along for the ride, if you've watched, you know, all the videos, some of the videos, even just this video, really means a lot to me. We put so much time and effort into these, but we really, it's all worth it because of the satisfaction in the comments that you guys leave. It really means a lot to know that there are people out there that, you know, put this on as a podcast or during their work day or during a workout or something and just, you know, listen to me talk, ramble about League of Legends esports for an hour plus, you know, hour and a half. This video is almost 2 hours, basically every single day. And it really means a lot to know that that is the case. And obviously, we've still got a lot more content coming. We're going to be covering Worlds. We cover all 4 of the major regions. So we're covering LCS. We're, you know, finishing up with the LEC very soon. And the LCK playoffs are really in the thick of things. We cover the NACL. You know, we cover everything on this channel. But if you're an LPL viewer and you've stuck around this whole time, if you've seen me cover every single game of the entire year, of spring, of summer, of every stage, the group stage, the qualification stage, the group ascend, the playoffs, all of it, again, it really just means a lot, and I really do appreciate you guys' support. You guys are why I do this, but I don't want to get too sentimental. We're not done with the year just yet. I think the 4 teams are going to do really well at Worlds. I think BLG is obviously a big terror. I think Top Esports is one of those teams that can beat anybody, but I'm also kind of expecting them to flame out because that's just kind of what they do. Not for any sort of like actual logical reason, but just because it's Top Esports, and that seems to be kind of the trend with them. You know, teams like LNG, Weibo Gaming, you just don't know what you're going to get out of them. Watch Weibo Gaming make the finals again. I think that could be a lot of fun, but you know, we'll cover all of this when we get into Worlds, when we get into our full preview. Of course, we'll be going over all 4 of these teams in depth in that video in just a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, but obviously check out the rest of the channel as well. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.